Greetings, you smaller than average warlord titans, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
Let's have a chat about some remarkably little guys.
With the upcoming release of the Horus Heresy Legions Imperialis, you may have some questions about Epic, GW's previous small-scale game set in the grim darkness of the far future. So we thought it would be instructive for both you and us to have a quick romp through the history of Epic's different editions, so that you can see how far the lineage of the new game goes back.
Also, just for clarity, this won't be an exhaustive dive into every element of every edition of Epic. You can see the length of this video, it would be a lot longer if that's what it was. This video is intended as a general overview of the whole thing. Basically a longer version of that Warhammer community article they recently put out, but we wrote this before that was published, so hush your mouth. Plus there are parts of this that we will no doubt take a closer look at in the future if you've not had your fill of very tiny warfare. Anyway, let's first look at some games that weren't technically called Epic.
One of the interesting things about Epic as a game system is that it wasn't called Epic to begin with. The first Epic release was the ADEPTUS Titanicus box in late 1988, with rules by Jervis Johnson. This is not to be confused with the 2018 reboot of ADEPTUS Titanicus, but there's going to be a lot of reused names in this video, so you should just get used to that sort of thing right now. ADEPTUS Titanicus was a game set 10,000 years before 40k proper in the Horus Heresy, the first game set during that period, in fact. The box pitted 3 Imperial Warlord Titans against 3 Renegade Warlord Titans, and so that the box would not be the size of a small bungalow, it was in a new smaller scale that would come to be known as Epic Scale. So the Titans were relatively tiny. We don't have a full one to demonstrate the scale ourselves, but here's the head and arm of one from this time period. Hope that helps. Speaking of their relative tininess, the given height of a Warlord Titan has always been a bit fuzzy, and has been described as being anywhere from 33 to 200 metres. But in White Dwarf 108, when Titanicus was announced, they are described as being 80 feet tall, which is just over 24 metres, so they were canonically tiny too. For a Warlord Titan, anyway.
The following year, rules and models for various smaller units like infantry and tanks were added to Titanicus through new rules in White Dwarf, much of which was later compiled into Codex Titanicus, eventually leading to another epic scale box game called Space Marine. No, not that one. This was another game set in the Horus Heresy, compatible with Titanicus, where astronomically small squads of Space Marines battled each other with the help of tiny land raiders and rhinos. Since these Space Marines were so small, they were 5 to a single 20 by 20mm base. Also, the Space Marine box is where that Jim Burns art that GW used to use all the time originally comes from. I think. I'm pretty sure anyway. They've reused it so much it's kinda hard to keep track. Now, technically speaking, due to the Titanicus rules in White Dwarf, Space Marine wasn't really doing much that Titanicus wasn't already doing on its own, but regardless, these two games are considered to be the first edition of Epic, a name that seemingly grew from the tagline of epic battles between gigantic robots on the Titanicus box, with the epic battles part becoming part of the branding enough to get its own stylized logo at one point. And even before the game started calling itself Epic, the term was used on boxes to distinguish the epic scale models from the regular sized ones. More and more units and Titan classes were added to the game, along with fully fledged rules for Orcs and Eldar, and since the game was increasingly pulling away from the original theme of just being humans versus humans in the Heresy, what happened next made a lot of sense.
The second edition of Epic was, once again, released as 2 technically separate but compatible games. In 1991 there was a second edition of Space Marine. This time the game was catapulted into the present day of the far future. Yeah, that's right. Allowing for more conventional 40k armies and battles. Just, you know, smaller. In 1994 this would be followed by Titan Legions, which catered for the largest war machines of the 41st millennium. Notably, the box set contained an Imperator-class Titan, which is one of the most iconic things in the 40k universe that we don't really get to see much of anymore outside of artwork. Fingers crossed it eventually gets added to Legions, I guess. There were a bunch of expansion sets to this edition, giving rules for various factions like Chaos, Tyranids, Orcs and Squats. These were usually box sets which didn't contain miniatures, something unusual today but was a thing GW did fairly frequently at the time. The Dark Millennium box for 2nd edition 40k, for example. Although it is a little weird that since the term epic was very attached to the system by now, the Hive War box that gave us rules to play Tyranids at epic scale would have logos for Epic, Space Marine and Titan Legions, which, if I'm being completely honest, feels like maybe too many logos for just one box. No offense.
Okay, we've been saying epic scale a lot in this video so far, so I feel we should really address what that means. Epic scale broadly meant 6mm miniatures, so a regular dude would be just over half a centimetre tall, with everything else scaled to that. In theory. In reality, the scale was a little all over the place, with some things like weapons being wildly overscaled, and others like vehicles generally being underscaled. Although, let's be honest, Warhammer and scale have always had an odd relationship, and sizes tend to creep up over time too. Like, how tall a Space Marine is relative to a regular human in the fluff, and how tall a model of a Space Marine is relative to a model of a regular human, have rarely matched up all that well. These are all playing pieces for wargames at the end of the day. Certain abstractions are used to allow them to better fill those roles as well as cater to the limitations of the materials they're made from, and Epic was just more abstracted than you'd usually get from GW. The scale of GW's modern small-scale games, like the upcoming Legions Imperialis, is about 8mm, so they're a bit bigger than the old stuff, although they have started calling this new scale Epic Scale as well. As I said, GW and scale have an odd relationship, and everything with them must always be at least slightly confusing for some reason. However, from what we've seen so far, this new version seems to be much more consistent in scale across the range than old Epic ever was. And GW has said that you can use the old Epic models for Legions if you really want. Although, as Games Workshop themselves have said, once the units start getting a little bit bigger, the size disparity between the scales can be a lot.
Oh, and since we're talking about the models themselves, like much of GW's output, the Epic range was mostly a mix of plastics and metals, ranging from simple tanks that could be stepped on without any damage to anything beyond maybe your foot, to multi-part metal vehicles that I'm not sure how comfortable I feel sneezing too close to. There were even Forge World resin minis released in the latter end of the game's lifespan. And there is something special about seeing even a small force of Epic minis together. Being able to hold an entire detachment in a single hand is just really fun. They're also adorable, especially when put alongside their full-sized equivalents. I feel that this needs to be addressed. This right here, this is adorable. Love it. Anyway, 2nd edition Epic was pretty well regarded. But time waits for no man, even if that man is a 50 or possibly 24 meter tall bipedal robot. And the next edition would come along shortly.
If there's a big theme to 3rd edition, it was simplification. Not only was it released in 1997 as just one game, now called Epic 40,000, but the rules were streamlined massively, flattening options down greatly in a manner that may feel familiar to those of you who have been looking at combi weapons in 10th edition 40k. This edition was well thought of by the people that wrote it, with Jervis Johnson and Andy Chambers both publicly stating that they thought it was one of the best systems they ever wrote at one point or another. Sadly, this did not seem to translate to the players, who seemed to not really care for the new direction, and the popularity of Epic began to wane. Still, it was supported by a couple of dedicated magazines that gave new rules and such to the game. The first was Firepower, which ran for 4 issues, and the second was Epic 40,000 magazine, which took over from Firepower and ran for a further 10. Although this meant there was new stuff going on with Epic, the fact that the magazine was handled by Fanatic Press did also signal that it was no longer a mainline Games Workshop thing, and would be a specialist game from here on out. Although it seems that Epic wasn't quite ready to quit being more than just one game, as rules appeared in the first issue of the Epic 40,000 magazine for Adeptus Titanicus 2, written by Gav Thorpe. Take a shot. Initially billed as replacement rules for Titans in Epic 40k, they would later be said to not work super well in that role a few issues later, and so would be thought of as a completely separate game afterwards.
Meaning that the current Adeptus Titanicus is either the second, third, or fourth version of the game, depending on how you count it.
Also notable is that this is the edition where the infantry bases changed. They went from 20 by 20mm squares to 40 by 12mm rectangles. This further lends to an issue with the Epic system where how you base minis is pretty much up to you. Like, go type in Epic Space Marine bikes into your search engine of choice and tell me what the standard way of basing them is supposed to be. The official answer is, depends on the edition. The unofficial answer is, don't worry about it too much.
The 4th edition of Epic, usually referred to as Epic Armageddon, was released in 2003, and was produced with a lot of collaboration with the community through the medium of the internet. Fantastic new invention. And as such, the rules were available for free through GW's website, although print versions were also released. This version of the game brought back some of the nuance lost in the previous edition, although we have read it wasn't quite as good at handling really big games as the previous one. Actually, one thing we haven't really mentioned anywhere is that Epic, regardless of edition, does stand out from a lot of GW games in that it used centimetres for measurements rather than inches like the mainline Warhammer games, or abstract concepts that are also technically inches like Kill Team. Which made a lot of sense since it was a smaller scale that allowed them to get finer measurements without messing around with half or quarter inches. Although GW have also done that in some old games, to be fair. Also, since the base sizes had changed over time, Epic Armageddon's approach to how to base the minis was fairly broad and meant you could technically make some very silly bases that were wholly within the letter, if not the spirit of the guidelines. Here's some we came up with ourselves. Anyway, support for Epic Armageddon would continue for many years, getting an expansion in 2005 with Swordwind, but eventually that support would dry up around 2013, and Epic would officially be dead. But not really.
Once Epic was no longer officially supported, it was a natural progression for the online community to take over. However, this wasn't just in the form of a continuation of Epic Armageddon, although that did live on as the community-driven NetEA. There was also NetEpic, which was based on what many perceived to be the best edition of the game, 2nd edition. These are both still easily available now should you wish to play these games without sourcing physical rulebooks from a few decades ago. And there's various other fan-made expansions and variants knocking about too. The lack of new models and the difficulty of getting specific old ones was also filled in by plenty of third-party companies producing proxies, and the rise of 3D printing has meant that there are a lot of options for those of you not wanting to spend your free time trawling eBay. Hell, you can even find even smaller versions of the models, like these 3mm orcs I painted a while ago, which managed to make epic scale grots look quite tall, which is not an easy task.
There are also a couple of other games that use the epic scale aircraft, namely Aeronautica Imperialis, no, not the modern one, the old Forge World one, and Bombers over the Sulphur River, so those models saw a little more life there. And of course, now epic scale has returned, albeit slightly larger, with a new Adeptus Titanicus, a new Aeronautica Imperialis, and very shortly, Legions Imperialis, which, since it has cross-compatibility with Titanicus's models, and being set in the Horus Heresy, makes it feel not only like a revival of Epic, but more specifically a revival of the 1st edition of Space Marine. So for those of you who are going to be diving into this new system, just be aware that there was a fairly long legacy leading up to this point.
Or at the very least a mildly confusing one where Epic was frequently called anything other than Epic. Hey all, thank you for watching, and thank you for your patience as this one, once again, took way longer to put together than it should have. It was supposed to be out like 3 weeks ago, but all manner of things got in the way. I suppose we should be grateful that Legions Imperialis has been delayed, gave us a bit of breathing room to get this out before the game showed up. If you enjoyed this, then please let us know with a like, a comment, or if you go to patreon.com/snipeandwib with money. And if you've gotten this far and you're planning to buy the new box set, please let us know which Legion you're planning to paint your Marines as in Legions Imperialis. I'm planning to do Sons of Horus, personally. Anyway, you all take care of yourselves. See you next time.
Notably, the box set contained an Imperator-class Titan, which makes me sound funny when I say it in a silly voice. I don't know what that little giggle was, and I'm afraid to ask.